Hey guys, Comic Boom here to review Jinny Hex one-shot special. I'm so excited to finally be able to review a comic book that puts a smile on my face. It's nice. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I'm a fan of Jonah Hex. I'm a huge fan of Jonah Hex. I've got I love Jimmy Palmiotti's and Justin Gray's run, both prior to the, in 2006, and also the New 52 run for All-Star Western. I love that. And I love the Tallulah Black run with Jonah Hex, issues 16 and 17, The Tale of Tallulah Black. I just love those series. And I love the End of the Trail, issue 34, the last issue of All-Star Western. Unfortunately, it was the last one. But, man, I love all things Jonah Hex. And I love me some Darwin Cook classic covers of Jonah Hex. Good Lord, this is really good stuff here, guys. Just really great stuff. And this two-sheet cover, which I like to think that's Tallulah Black at one point with Jonah Hex. But in any event, guys, Jinny Hex. What is it about Jinny Hex that makes this character interesting? Well, I got to tell you that Jinny Hex is very different than her father. She's very different than her father. She was first introduced in the pages of a Batman Walmart special, which I think was written by Bendis. I do know that Young Justice was written all by Bendis. And unfortunately, while Jinny Hex, as indicated on the cover, while she was in fact while she comes from the pages of Young Justice, the reality is that her background was not explored in Young Justice. We learned absolutely nothing about Jinny Hex in Young Justice at all, other than the fact that she was into girls, which, okay, not a big deal. Her girlfriend, her high school sweetheart, she calls Little Bird, and we meet her in this issue. For some reason, I've read it a couple times, and I guess I had a brain fart, guys, but for the life of me, I couldn't find the actual name of her girlfriend in this opening one-shot. She just kept calling her high school sweetheart Little Bird, which I thought was a really nice callback to Jonah Hex, because Jonah Hex's first love was White Fawn, who was a beautiful Aboriginal woman of the Apache, who was I believe the chief's daughter, and White Fawn met an untimely fate. Hopefully, Little Bird won't end up with the same ending as White Fawn ended up for Jonah Hex. The differences between Jinny Hex and Jonah Hex are quite significant, because Jonah Hex is a very dark character of the Wild West, a very dark character. He was a bounty hunter. In his early years, Jonah Hex was badly beaten by his father. His mother sat idly back, not that she had much choice, while Jonah Hex's father sold Jonah Hex into slavery to the Apache tribe. Ultimately, he ended up befriending the Apache tribe, saving the chief, and falling in love with White Fawn, then being banished from the tribe, and then ending up fighting on the Confederate side in the Civil War. Then he didn't like the idea of slavery. He liked fighting alongside his brothers in the Confederacy, but he ultimately had to leave because of slavery. He hated slavery because he himself was a slave to the Apache. And so when Jonah Hex ultimately surrendered to the North, unfortunately, when he surrendered to the North in his long convoluted origin, it's not convoluted, it's a great origin. I'm making this short. When Jonah Hex surrendered to the North, he was deemed to be a traitor, and ultimately he was always looked down upon by his former allies on the Confederate side. And the reason why Jonah Hex always wore the Confederate colors was to mark his own shame. Jonah Hex had a lot of self-loathing. He didn't like himself. He hated that he had to be as dark as he was. And he's a much darker version than even Batman, and he wore the Confederate colors as a sense of shame, so that when he wandered into a Western town, people would look down upon him in shame, and that his Confederate coat would always shame him and mark him in such a way that he always wanted to be an outlier and an outcast. And that's why he embraced being a bounty hunter and chasing those things and eliminating those forces that were even darker than he felt he was in his soul. And that's what makes Jonah Hex so fascinating. Along comes Jinny Hex, his great-great-granddaughter. I can't help thinking that Jonah Hex would be so proud of his great-great-granddaughter, how how much different she is than him. The one thing she has of his that she inherited down through this century and a half is that trademark Jonah Hex red hair. And what's interesting is even Jinny Hex's mother, whose name is Stella Hex, also sports that red hair. Now, what's interesting here is there is a character called Tallulah Black, which I personally love. And I wonder if Tallulah Black is Jinny Hex's great-great-grandmother. Because in a fantastic storyline with Jonah Hex, in fact, the last time Jonah Hex, his ending run on the New 52, written by Justin Palmiotti, contributed to by Darwin Cook, Justin Gray, I believe. Tallulah Black and Jonah Hex literally sail off into the sunset together. And so you got to wonder what happened after that. I'm completely ignoring Jonah Hex's appearance in death metal because I think death metal is kind of a joke. I like to think death metal never happened because as far as I'm concerned, if everything matters, then nothing matters. So death metal means nothing to me. So I like to think that I ignore death metal and Jonah Hex's appearance in that, which I think is humiliating and embarrassing for the character. And I think they had children, and ultimately the descendants led to Jinny Hex. Now, what's really interesting here are some of the Easter eggs that writer Vissagio, Magdalene Vissagio, does, and Gleb Melnikov, the artist, does I think he does a reasonably good job on the art. I can't complain. I thought the art was pretty good. I was particularly fascinated by the villain itself. This is one of those origins where the lead character, where Jinny Hex herself, while she is a legacy character, her great-grandfather was Jonah Hex himself. Jinny's father is, in fact, one of Jonah Hex's villains, an insignificant villain by the name of Jack Duckett. Now, Jack Duckett, interestingly enough, Jack Duckett is actually a guy who, back during the days of Jonah Hex, during the days of the Wild West, he was looking for something called the God's Eye. And Jonah Hex, he hired Jonah Hex as a bounty hunter to help him find the God's Eye. Jonah Hex found it for him, but then he tried to betray Jonah Hex and tried to kill him. And Jonah Hex got one up on him and in turn killed him instead. However, because of Jack Duckett's exposure to the God's Eye, it actually imbued him with the gift of an unconquerable life, as writer Vissagio describes it. And for that reason, this Jack Duckett could survive for 150 years, and he ultimately spent that time, his brief exposure to the God's Eye made him realize how powerful it was, and apparently the power to remake the world, and so he spent all that time looking for it. And ultimately he found out, at one point, he seduced Stella Hex. The granddaughter of Jonah Hex was seduced by this Jack Duckett, this immortal or long-lived Jack Duckett, and of course, Jinny Hex was born. So this Jack Duckett guy is actually the father of Jinny Hex. Now, that's very interesting. And one of the most interesting things about it is that it opens up the possibility that Jonah Hex is still alive. Because if Jack Duckett can still live long by having by merely brief exposure to the God's Eye, if that can prolong your life, then why can't it prolong Jonah Hex's life? Maybe Jonah Hex is still alive. And it's even hinted at in this issue that Jonah Hex might still be alive, I would argue, because at one point, the soul of Jinny Hex's mother says to her before she leaves, she says that he is still around, that he has not completely left. And she could either be alluding to Three-Eyed Jack, who is the villain, her father, or maybe when she makes that cryptic reference, maybe she's referencing that Jonah Hex himself is still around. And that's what I particularly love, those types of Easter eggs, that type of hinting here. This is planting the seeds of a really great series. Unfortunately, this is just a one-shot, and it's so frustrating. But because this really opens up the possibilities of this being just a really, really great series and a great tale. Now, Some of the other Easter eggs here that are worth mentioning. I already mentioned, and I have them listed here. I mentioned Tallulah Black. I love the fact that even though Tallulah Black's not mentioned, I like to think that Tallulah Black is involved as part of the legacy of Jinny Hex. I also love that Jinny Hex, her name is Virginia Hex. Her actual full name is Virginia Hex. And for those of you who may not know, Virginia is also the name of Jonah Hex's mother. So that's a nice callback and an honor to the Jonah Hex legacy. Also, the little bird white fawn dichotomy. I like the fact that Jonah Hex's first love was an Aboriginal woman by the name of White Fawn, and Jinny Hex's girlfriend, her name is, she calls her Little Bird. I like that. I think there's a sort of poetic symmetry there. I also like the fact that Jinny Hex is beautiful. I like that. She's a beautiful young woman, and she's got this beautiful flowing red hair. That's very different than who Jonah Hex was. Jonah Hex was he was ugly on the outside, but had a darkness in his but his soul, while he fought darkness, he was a good man at heart, but he always denied his own goodness, but he always ended up doing the right thing, even if doing the right thing meant doing some very, very bad things. And here's Jinny Hex in a very different world, in a very different America, future America, and so different than her great-great-grandfather in so many ways, and yet she still has that grit and that determination and that attitude. I also like the fact that it calls back into the present. The callback we get into the past is through a treasure chest. And I like the fact that the way that the writer Vissagio connects the present with Jinny Hex, connects it to the past, is through a treasure chest. And the fact that very clearly Jonah Hex acquired various artifacts during his adventures. And during those adventures, he put those artifacts in a treasure chest that ultimately is a keepsake and the inheritance of Jinny Hex. And she takes that treasure chest with her wherever she goes. And it's that treasure chest that she shows her father, Three-Eyed Jack, her father, Jack Duckett, who at the time, she didn't, all of a sudden, when her mother dies, Stella Hex, her mother, dies of ovarian cancer. Within a couple weeks of her mother dying, a couple weeks after the funeral, this Jack Duckett guy shows up and says, "I think I might be your dad." And of course, he proves to her that he is. And they actually become really good friends, and she's getting to know her dad again. But ultimately, he betrays her because he just wants to get into that treasure chest where he finds the God's Eye, and he wears it in his head, and it sort of gives him some powers. And it takes the combined forces of Jinny and her girlfriend, Little Bird, to essentially defeat him. And that's the crux of the story. And as the story progresses, there's also a nice little callback, because at one point, Jinny Hex and the entire southern town that they're in is transported back into the Wild West, which is kind of interesting. And what I also find interesting is the word heck. Instead, Jack Duckett really hates Jonah Hex, and he hates the Hex legacy so much, despite the fact that he's actually part of the legacy. He hates the legacy, and he always refers to it as heck, H-E-C-K, not Hex. When he betrayed Jonah Hex, he referred to Jonah Hex as heck, and Jonah derisively said, "It's Hex, you moron," and then shot him dead, or he thought he was killing him dead. And that idea of always renaming things heck instead of Hex, even the garage that Jinny Hex works in is actually called Heck, H-E-C-K, Hex Garage. And I like the callback there, because the reason it's called Heck is obviously, and you got to read between the lines on this is a callback. It's likely because of the contempt shown by her father, who is her primary antagonist and one of the arch enemies of Jonah Hex back in the day. So he calls it Hex Garage. That was probably because of Jack Duckett's influence. And even in the past, when he transports Jinny and Little Bird into the past and the whole town into the Wild West, there's even a stable. It's called Hex Saddle and Stable. So there's these little pot shots at Jonah Hex you can see taking place throughout the narrative. There's even a spot where he's having a conversation with Jinny, and Jack says to her, "Well, heck." And she goes, "Hex." She corrects him. And that was before he betrayed her. So even while he's being sort of the nice guy, playing the nice role of father, he was still derisively under his breath. You could read the contempt that Jack Duckett has for the Hex legacy. And that introduces an interesting dichotomy into the origin of Jinny Hex, that her own father is actually a villain and one of the villains of her great-great-grandfather. And what a great name for a villain, Three-Eyed Jack. That's a great name for a villain. And I just love the callback here. It's really good, Three-Eyed Jack. But in any event, a couple of the other aspects that I think really sell this comic book is the idea of roaming America. And because in modern day America, obviously, you can't hop on your horse and go on horseback and, you know, gallop into every town in America like you did back in the Wild West. I mean, you could probably do that in parts, you know, maybe in parts of Montana and certain other states, North Dakota, South Dakota, what have you. But for the most part, you know, you'd probably be given a ticket. You can't just ride a horse anywhere. How do they do that? How do you bring the Wild West into the modern day? Well, you do so through a spiritual journey. You do so through a road trip. And I love how this ends with Jinny, or Jins as her best friend and I guess lover, I'm assuming. Little Bird tells her. They hop in their pickup truck and say, let's go on an adventure. And that's exactly what they do. And that's how this one-shot special ends. So that's reminiscent of a couple of people hopping on horseback in the Wild West and roaming America. They're basically going on an adventure here, and they don't know where they're going, but Jinny is taking her treasure chest with her, a treasure chest that is filled with all kinds of things. At one point, we see that one of the things that she picks up on, it looks to be sort of a box. Is that a mother box? Does she have a mother box in that treasure chest? I mean, she surrendered the God's Eye to Superman in this issue at the end, but there are other things in that treasure chest that maybe it's better that this treasure chest is given to the Justice League in its entirety. One of the things that her father said, that the Three-Eyed Jack said when he was going through the treasure chest, is that it never seemed to end. Every time he took something out of the chest, there seemed to be more stuff in the chest that propped up, which suggests that the treasure chest itself and has magical properties, or perhaps ultra technological properties, which make it something more than just an ordinary treasure chest. And then, of course, again, at one point he's holding a square, a box. Could that be a boom box? What is it? At one point it looks like a sealed book. Could that be the crime Bible? The famous crime Bible that Jonah Hex had to deal with during the New 52 and the All-Star Western. Just to remind people, there was a time when Jonah Hex actually visited the 21st century in the pages of All-Star Western. And at one point he even got facial reconstructive surgery to eliminate his scars, because he came into the present and he got into a car accident. The doctor saw his face and they thought, boy, this car accident really did a number on your face. They didn't realize that he looked that way to begin with. And they gave him plastic surgery and they fixed his face up. And then after that, he looked like Clint Eastwood. And then he goes back into his old time and he ends up with a nice looking face with Tallulah Black sailing off into the sunset. Again, fantastic series, guys. You got to check out All-Star Western. If you can pick up and trade, go to Comixology right now. You could probably get it on sale, man. Anything written by Jimmy Palmiotti, Justin Gray, pick that stuff up. Great stuff. All-Star Western in particular, there's that final trade paperback, End of the Trail. Fantastic stuff. But I like the way that this issue, it harkens back to so much. And this is just in a one-shot. And finally, I say again, the possibility that Jonah Hex is still alive. I just absolutely love that. It's planting the seeds. Look, as much as I'm not a big fan of death metal, the reality is that Jonah Hex is in death metal, albeit he's dead. He's very dead, and he looks terrible because, of course, he's dead, and arguably he looks terrible already with the scars. But that's one thing death metal got wrong, is that he actually doesn't have scars. They were removed. But that's one way in which you pay homage to Jonah Hex in any story. You got to draw the scars, even though he technically never had them anymore. His last appearance, as far as I'm concerned. But in any event, the idea that Jonah Hex could still be alive. Is Jonah Hex alive somewhere in the treasure chest itself? Who knows? I mean, we know that he sailed off into the sunset with Tallulah Black. At some point, they must have had children, which ultimately led to Stella Hex, and then Stella having a daughter with Jack Duckett, named Jinny Hex. And so ultimately, the legacy is there, and this works. And I want to give compliments to Magdalene Vissagio. Thank you. You did a really good job here. I enjoyed this. I thought you gave enough callbacks to Jonah Hex that I'm into this. I'm into this story. I'd be lying if I said I wish there wasn't Tallulah Black. I wish there would have been some illusions, or we would have seen some Tallulah Black in this. I find it interesting that Tallulah Black was a brunette, and Jonah Hex fell in love with Tallulah Black. And Jinny Hex's love, I believe, is Little Bird, and she's also a brunette. So both Jonah Hex and Jinny Hex are in love with brunettes. I think that's that's just me reading something into it. But anyways, I really enjoyed this, and it put a smile on my face. And it's nice to have a smile on my face reading a DC comic, because I haven't been able to do that in a while. So guys, tell me what you think of Jonah Hex. If I missed anything, if I missed any callbacks, by all means, feel free to enlighten me. I had a great time reviewing this. I had a great time doing all my thumbnails on this. This is a lot of fun. And again, is Tallulah Black Jinny Hex's great-great-grandmother? I think that she is. I hope that she is. Tallulah Black is a fantastic character. Wouldn't it be great if Tallulah Black or Jonah Hex could make an appearance in a Jinny Hex adventure? Man, I'm looking forward to that. And wouldn't that even be really good if Jimmy Palmiotti could be the one that writes that issue, and perhaps even have we can't have Darwin Cook draw it anymore, but even have Amanda Connor do the art. That would just be great. I would love that. Or any other artist. There's a whole slew of artists that can draw Western, really great stuff. So guys, thank you so much for watching this. And hey, until next time, guys, Comic Boom out.